Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads. This is an episode of Worldwise. I'm Isaac Stonefish, Associate Editor at Foreign Policy Magazine here in DC, and I'm here with Stephanie Kleine-Ahlbrandt, the Northeast Asia Director of the International Crisis Group, who's based in Beijing. Stephanie, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Stephanie Kleine-Ahlbrandt. I'm here in Beijing with International Crisis Group, and I came out here in 2008 and set up this office and have been here ever since. That's about all.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being on today. I want to start with a just very basic question about the dispute that's been happening between China and Japan over these group of very small islands in the East China Sea, which the Chinese call the Diaoyu and the Japanese call the Senkaku. Why is there such a big deal going on about these tiny islands in the middle of the ocean?
Well, these islands have been disputed for millennia and millennia. And for the last about 30 years, there's been kind of a tacit agreement between China and Japan that they disagreed about these islands, but they weren't going to enter into any of the details, try to resolve it, etc. They were going to sort of shelve the dispute, put it aside, and focus on trying to improve bilateral relations, because having had a war and having had the fallout of that in the bilateral relationship, and really both parties needed each other economically. And that actually has held quite well. Up until 2010, in September, you might remember that there was an incident when a Chinese ship captain rammed a Japanese Coast Guard vessel, and that was the first sort of crisis in the bilateral relationship that we've seen really in decades. This would be the second big crisis. And this crisis was brought on when the Japanese government decided to purchase the islands from their private owner in order to forestall or prevent the nationalist Tokyo governor from himself purchasing the islands. He had already planned to do it. He'd raised the money, and he had planned actually to build structures on the island. So in the government of Japan's mind, it was a preventive measure. It was to forestall a worse crisis in the China-Japan relationship. However, in so doing, the Chinese already took this as a change in the status quo, and thereby, a breach of this tacit agreement that I spoke about for 30 years, where really both sides agreed not to strengthen their sovereignty. Japan has been de facto occupying and patrolling the islands. So China feels that by nationalizing the islands, Japan has breached that. And then we've seen this sort of wave of 3 or 4 major Chinese actions in retaliation to that.
And so why do you think the Chinese decided to make a big deal out of this now? It seems like there's been a lot of things that they could have decided to make into a big situation, but hadn't. I mean, why summer of 2012?
Well, to a certain degree, Japan feels that the timing was necessary because this nationalist governor was about to purchase the islands. China feels that the timing was deliberate on Japan's side to sort of strike at the moment when China was focused the most on the internal political situation, the jockeying up until the 18th Party Congress coming up next month. And I think that partly was responsible for the Chinese feeling like they were really going to hit back very assertively on this. But it has to also be said that this is part of a pattern that we've seen out of China for the last at least 2 years. I call it reactive assertiveness, and that means that other countries, including Vietnam, the Philippines, and Japan, all of whom have been actually more assertively defending their own claims. It's not just China, right? Though a lot of people are talking only about China. They've also been more assertively defending their claims. And so when something happens, there's a clash, there's an incident, there's fishermen that are arrested, this type of thing. China actually takes this as an opportunity to then disproportionately react. So, for example, the ship captain arrest, that's when you might remember that we had this sort of cutting off of rare earths. The Chinese, hauled in the Japanese ambassador at 3 a.m. It was a major full-on bilateral crisis in the relationship. Scarborough Shoal, which was, this incident in the Philippines and Chinese claimed disputed waters off of a shoal that essentially was a fishing dispute that ended up in a month-long standoff. And we've also seen the same recently in Vietnam. So Vietnam passed in June a maritime law, and China took that as a reason to itself pass a baseline law, open up disputed waters to exploration by CNOOC, and a whole other, a whole host of other issues, a whole host of other things. They essentially declared Sansha. They declared disputed island as they put an administrative unit on it and formed a military garrison. So it's a pattern where China has been, again, saying that we are not the ones who started it, but once something starts, the Chinese really throw the book at whoever it is, and that's whether it's the Philippines, Vietnam, or Japan. We've seen it really as something over the last 2 years.
So you just mentioned Sansha and the military garrison there, and can you give us a little more background about what exactly is happening in the South China Sea and how that dispute is different from the dispute between China and Japan? And also I'd love to hear your thoughts on, with this dispute, why China is so intent on negotiating bilaterally, with Vietnam, with the Philippines, as opposed to doing this through a multilateral forum. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, South China Sea dispute involves a lot more claimants. It involves China, Indonesia. Sorry, Indonesia is not a formal claimant. China, Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, and there's one more.
Taiwan.
Yeah, it could be that.
That's a complicated one.
Exactly. And it's actually, they're very, very complicated. A lot of the claims are very overlapping. And what's interesting to note is that a lot of the countries, we hear a lot about China versus the Philippines or China versus Vietnam. But you know that like Malaysia and the Philippines have major territorial issues between them. And they actually have bigger squabbles between them, arguably, than China does between China and Vietnam. So that's part of the reason that it's been tough to see ASEAN come together with a real position on this. But the South China Sea is different from the East China Sea. I think you can distinguish it mostly by, first, the number of claimants. Obviously, East China Sea is bilateral. The U.S. is involved by virtue of the self-defense treaty it has with Japan, whereby it has said that the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands are included in that. But the number of claimants is really, I think, the big difference, and also the extent of militarization. Obviously, Japan has a full-fledged self-defense force, a very modernized navy, and the Philippines, just to take an example, it really sent its only Navy cutter to respond to this incident in the Scarborough Shoal that turned into the month-long standoff. One of the reasons it turned into such a problem was that the Philippines has so few law enforcement vessels, which is the kind of Coast Guard vessels that one should use in these disputes. So it sent out its only Navy cutter. And this was taken, as a huge issue by China, right? When you send out a Navy ship, it certainly immediately escalates a dispute, right? But so I'm just trying to give that as an example to show you that and that's really their only Navy cutter. So there's just no comparison between most of these Southeast Asian countries that have disputes with China and China's military. Whereas in Japan and China, one could arguably say that China is behind vis-a-vis Japan's forces. And clearly, if you put Japan and the U.S. together, then they're certainly lagging in terms of the military balance. So in some ways, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we know Japan has been pretty demilitarized since World War II. And can you explain a bit about how their Coast Guard is functioning as a de facto navy? How is that working?
That's right. So, the self-defense forces are very constrained historically and, because of the Constitution, although there's a lot more heated sentiment in Japan these days looking at changing the Constitution to rename the forces from self-defense forces otherwise. So it's really been the Coast Guard that's had de facto, responsibility for this issue. And Japan's Coast Guard is very well known internationally. It's very professional. They are very, they're very well equipped. The funny thing is that, if I talk to the Japanese Coast Guard, they all tell me, oh, the Chinese boats are so much better, so much faster, and so much newer. And then I talk to the Chinese, they say, oh no, the Japanese boats are so much better. So each side actually thinks that the other side has bigger, faster, newer Coast Guard vessels. What's clear is that on the Japanese side, they feel overwhelmed at this point to a certain extent. They've upped their Coast Guard vessels in the Senkaku Diaoyu area, from 3 to plus 30, essentially, over the past month, because China has taken to regular patrols whereby they go into the disputed waters for, 2 hours or so, and then they leave. China has been engaging in a very fast increase in the quality and quantity of its law enforcement vessels. Now, in China, it's not Coast Guard. It's really two major law enforcement agencies. One is called Marine Surveillance, and the other is called Fisheries. And so it's almost like having two Coast Guards that they actually compete with one another. They actually are attached to two different ministries that directly compete for the same budget money in the state council. So this has helped to really stoke a kind of a Coast Guard race, arms race in a way in China, where both are trying to modernize their fleet. They're trying to go further and further out for longer periods of time. They have more sophisticated navigation systems. This is what allows, for example, when there's a fishing boat in trouble, as we saw in Scarborough Shoal, immediately you can have law enforcement vessels there, which, who knows, maybe 20 years ago that would have never happened, right? So these disputes actually escalate very quickly because of that, because boats can get out more quickly, because they have more communications. And on the China side, it has been to a certain extent motivated by the fact that both of these agencies would like to be the top dog in law enforcement, in maritime law enforcement for China, and neither one of them is really, been chosen as the one that would. There's actually 5 in total law enforcement agencies, and that means that both of them are competing for maybe one day. If China decides to have an overall coordination, they both want to be chosen for it. So both of those types of vessels are out in the Senkaku Diaoyu, and it's for the purpose of layman, it's just going to be seen as a Chinese Coast Guard. There is a Chinese Coast Guard technically, but it doesn't do this type of it does more sort of rescue missions than this type of stuff. So, and then on the Japanese side, as I said, they have been upping their contingent in disputed waters. They have also, they told me on a recent trip, been focusing a lot on a lot of preventive measures. They said that when they encountered, this Chinese captain that really crashed into their boat in September 2010, they hadn't expected it. And so the boat was on its own. For example, there were no other, Coast Guard boats nearby. So it seems that they're trying to do everything they can to professionalize, to try and prevent any kind of run-in. And they're doing that through different types of formations, so they'll put their two boats together in kind of a V shape to try and guide, either, law enforcement vessels or fishing boats away from a certain area, or, to put themselves between, ostensibly, could be Chinese boats and the island in order to prevent Chinese boats from making it to the island. So, they're very constrained in what they can actually do. They can't shoot. They have arms on board, but there's no, the rules of engagement don't allow them to shoot at another vessel. And recently with fishing boats, they used, you might have read, water guns, water hoses to get these fishing vessels to go. So they're constrained, and that's a good thing because that actually keeps a lid on conflict to a certain extent, because if you had navies going out, you never know, it could get hotter very quickly, right?
So I just want to jump in there, and you mentioned before that the treaty between the U.S. and Japan protects the Diaoyu or Senkaku, and that explains in part why this dispute matters to Americans. But why should the U.S. care about a dispute between, say, China and Vietnam, or Brunei and the Philippines in the South China Sea?
Well, for the U.S., it really comes down to freedom of navigation. Both East China Sea and South China Sea are home to myriad sea lanes of communication, whereby, a massive amount of the world's sea commerce passes. And so, the U.S. has always had an interest in maintaining freedom of navigation, and they fear, I think, that in the event of any kind of conflict, that would be the first thing that could be sacrificed. So I think that that's one of the main issues. But of course, with regard to the treaty, that's a long-standing historical agreement between the U.S. and Japan, and the U.S. has been playing it, on both sides. It's got a very nuanced stance. On the one hand, it says that the treaty covers Senkaku Ryoyu Islands. On the other hand, the U.S. says that it takes no position in the territorial dispute between China and Japan over the Senkaku Ryoyu. So very nuanced. And so you have on both sides the Japanese complaining avidly that the Americans aren't, doing enough, and they're too ambiguous about their commitment, and then the Chinese saying, well, it's clear that they'll just go in for the Japanese, and it's because they're supporting the Japanese that the Japanese are so assertive, this kind of thing. So, but at the same time, the U.S. needs to, I think it needs to actually maintain the space to try and negotiate to keep both sides from doing something stupid, and getting us into some type of a conflict, not deliberately so much as through some type of an incident that it could be difficult for both sides to walk back, given, this upcoming power transition in China, and, more than likely upcoming elections in Japan that might see a change in government.
It seems that over the past, say, 10 years, relationship between China and Taiwan has been getting rosier and rosier, and we've heard very little about really anything about what Taiwan thinks about the islands. But I think more importantly, is Taiwan out of the picture for now, freed up kind of Chinese foreign policy space to focus on disputes with Japan and South China Sea, or do you think those aren't related? And how does Taiwan play in this?
Well, I can't really speak to Taiwan because I haven't done the research there yet. We've just started the research on this, and so I'd have to go. We don't usually speak about things that we haven't been able to research and write on. So Taiwan does have an important role to play. I do get the sense that for Taiwan and Japan, it is more of a fishing dispute. And there's much more leeway for them to come up with a way to manage the fishing, coming up with some sort of a management system for fishing. And I even understand that they were very close in March to an actual agreement. And then in April, that was when we heard for the first time that the Tokyo governor was planning on purchasing the islands. And so there was already this type of tension which was building up. So that agreement went by the wayside. And there was actually an announcement in the last 2 weeks, again, that agreement was being looked at. So from what I understand, it is more of a fishing issue between those two. But, Taiwan has the same claims as China does.
So let's move on to Myanmar or Burma. Over the last year, since Aung San Suu Kyi has been freed, there's been a lot of liberalization going on in Burma. And one of the, I don't know if casualties is the right word, but one of the outcomes of that is it seems like it's really hurt the relationship between China and Myanmar, as China seemed to formally treat Myanmar as a client state. And now they're really kind of coming out into their own and finding different partners. And I'm wondering what kind of lessons you think China is learning with its evolving relationship with Myanmar.
China is actually, looking at a lot of the dynamics that led to the cancellation of this massive hydropower project called the Myitsone Dam in September of last year. And essentially, China is looking at the way it does business in Myanmar. China essentially, the way it had done business up until now was to pay off the government and to assume that the government was going to be in a position to then compensate local persons, deal with the ethnic issues, this type of thing. And of course, it doesn't work that way. One has to have relationships on the ground with the stakeholders in the places that one's working. So China got in trouble in that regard, and so they're looking right now really across the board, even at guidelines on how to better do business. They're trying to engage with a broader variety of stakeholders across the country. They're doing a lot of people-to-people exchanges. And, people ask, well, aren't they learning these lessons in other countries, right? Because we have the same types of things that happen, obviously, with Chinese investments in other parts of the world. My sense is that Myanmar is obviously of higher importance to China strategically than, like, for example, African countries, although, unfortunately, Myanmar is very low in terms of the overall foreign policy priority for China. Low and in some ways getting lower. And so I think that they have an interest now in stepping up their game, precisely because, it's not just the Americans, it's the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Thais, the Singaporeans. The Japanese in particular have always been quite active and now are really making a push. And so I think that they realize that they need to ensure, for example, that their pipeline is still going to go forward. They're very nervous about the pipeline. And I think that they've gotten assurances that the pipeline will go forward, but it goes through some disputed territories, and so they need to learn these lessons. They need to learn them fast, and I think it's encouraging.
Can you explain what the pipeline is? Just tell us about that.
Yeah, I can't give you all the technical details because I haven't researched this in a while. So
I would just kind of say that it's a natural gas. What's moving between China and Myanmar and China?
I think it's natural gas and oil, and it's essentially a project that was dreamed up in Kunming in China. Actually, there's a huge amount of decentralization in the country, and a lot of these initiatives do come from local, from provinces, and then they make it up to the Beijing level. And it is a transshipment, and it's going to go straight into Kunming, and so they're building now. They're building the infrastructure in Kunming for the pipeline for the pipeline going into Kunming, and so and it's a pipeline that goes through some disputed areas. So.
Well, I also want to chat with you a bit about China's relationship with North Korea. It's been about 10 months since Kim Jong-il died and his son Kim Jong-un took power. And we saw a bit in 2011, China seemed to be increasingly fed up with North Korea and its provocations. Is the rule of Kim Jong-un, do they feel more optimistic about him actually opening up and turning North Korea into a more normal country, or do they think Kim Jong-un is just business as usual?
Well, China's relationships with Kim Jong-un got off to a rocky start because he essentially decided to launch this satellite. China didn't want a satellite launch. China felt that they weren't informed in good time, and that perhaps the Americans were informed earlier. They weren't given access to Kim Jong-un himself or very high-level officials for a very long time, and they felt, frankly, that they weren't able to really judge his intentions very much. The Chinese, of course, have had a plan to, have Chinese-style economic development in the country, and that's mostly because they want to see a stable situation where North Korea can take care of its people and, manage to curtail, any potential of collapse, any potential of, massive refugee flows, this type of thing. And, stability and maintaining this buffer against Western forces are really at the top of China's priority list, to the extent that denuclearization comes as a second priority. And so I think that our sense in crisis group was that the succession was much smoother than anyone had predicted. When Kim Jong-il died, everyone was talking about imminent collapse, which was really misguided because Kim Jong-il had started preparations for the succession 3 years before, including a transfer from the military back to the party, transfer of power, and these types of things. But I think that China was taken very much by surprise. I think that they have had a harder time. They've always had a hard time with North Korea. It's not a country they relish dealing with. They are very frustrated by it. But at the end of the day, they feel that they need to continue to work with it. It's a country on their border. Obviously, it's the Korean Peninsula, heavily militarized, open, technically an open conflict zone. You have South Korea after these incidents in 2010, the sinking of the Cheonan the torpedoing of the Cheonan and the shelling of Yongpyong Island. South Korea's military is on very high alert. There are still incidents happening even in the last few months on the Northern Limit Line, which is disputed territory between North and South Korea. And, we've had the specter of a third nuclear test hanging over this already for so long. Now, the sense is that China has made very clear to North Korea that a nuclear test would not be welcome during this year when China is focusing very much on its internal transition. It's a once-in-a-decade political transition here. And so they made that quite clear, and that's also why they were upset with regard to the missile launch. But so far there hasn't been a nuclear test, and there are about 16 different theories as to whether and how that will happen. And my colleague in Seoul, Dan Pinkston, who's actually our North Korea expert, has a better sense of all of that. But seen from China, the Chinese are watching very carefully Kim Jong-un. They're watching very carefully their investments. They are watching very carefully who the North Koreans are visiting. The North Koreans sent a high-level delegation to Singapore. I think Myanmar and Laos as well. China definitely noticed that. And China, wants to ensure that, to the extent possible, it doesn't feel that it has a wide amount of leverage over North Korea, but it wants to ensure that the leverage that it does have is used to put forward China's own interests, which, as I said, are really primarily about stability. China is actually also doing a lot of business in North Korea. There's a lot of coal and mineral wealth that is being transported just from having a look on the border. And when I was last in North Korea on my 4th visit, it's clear that there's a lot of business going on. Pyongyang is looking much more active, a lot of construction sites, a lot of new buildings. It's clear money is getting in, lots of big projects, dolphinariums, and all sorts of things.
Well, tell us about the dolphinarium. That doesn't seem like a normal big project development.
This is like bread and circuses. I mean, this is, I think I've been to 2 different amusement parks in Pyongyang, and this is the kind of thing you get in Pyongyang, but not out in the countryside. There is, Kim Jong-un is trying to appeal to a certain elite, and of course those that live in Pyongyang are the elite. And so this dolphinarium was a big project. In fact, when I was last there, he had visited the site the day that I was sort of seeing it from a mountaintop, and there was, all sorts of, traditional songs and music and all of this type of thing. And there it is. You can look at it on YouTube. It looks very enticing. And then also there's a brand new amusement park with, beautiful, shiny new rides from Italy. Really nice roller coasters and all this sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, this is part of, Pyongyang is looking now like, a 1950s, 1960s sort of Soviet, maybe Moscow or something. People have cell phones. People are, wearing nice clothes. Restaurants are full. Stores are full. People are going places. They look very busy. Construction is happening, but the sense is that my sense was, the last I was there, is that the divide between the countryside and Pyongyang is just getting larger and larger, because it doesn't seem as if there's the same level of investment in the countryside. People are still, a huge amount of labor has to go into really the most minor of tasks. At harvest time, it looks like some of the crops are really just dying on the fields because you can't get enough people to harvest them, and there's no mechanization. Very difficult lives out in the countryside. People, everyone on bicycles, if that, wheelbarrows, hauling wheelbarrows with rocks and this type of thing, and these types of steamer trucks. It's actually a truck that it's a wood-burn stove that makes this truck go. Have they ever had steamer trucks in America? I mean, I've never even heard of a steamer truck. I think that they sort of may have had them during the Korean War, and I think that they might have gone back to it. And I'm not sure. It's nice. It's kind of steampunky, but there is it is kind of, they're very, very, they pollute like crazy, and you need to have someone back there constantly filling the thing with wood. So, and a lot of stunting in the countryside. So. You do, though, see, I've been going to Pyongyang now since 2009, and really just in that period of time, a huge amount of change. So again, on 2 levels in many ways. And so that shows that money is coming into the country. That shows that there's wealth coming in, and that would then tally up with the Chinese, buying coal and minerals, right? But, I think that some people mistake that for sort of some kind of a real desire to completely reform the system. It's a planned economy. If you put more input in, you're going to see more output. It doesn't mean that there's been a liberalization of pricing, for example, or business people can decide what to sell and when. That's when you see those types of things, you'll know that, maybe there are going to be some real reforms, but I think that's in doubt right now. But the Chinese, of course, what they'd like is to see, they have no issue with, they have nothing to say about political systems, but they really have been pushing their system very hard, saying, look, and they've been inviting North Koreans to come to China, all sorts of places. Jilin University constantly hosting delegations, students, etc. For example, they're trying to, they want the penny to drop at some point. It just doesn't seem that it yet has.
Well, Stephanie, thanks so much for your time. Just have one more question for you. So come November, it seems very likely that the current president of China, Hu Jintao, will hand over to Xi Jinping. And what do we know, if anything, about what mark he'll make on China's foreign policy and any policy differences between Hu and Xi either this year or in the years to come?
Well, I don't do predictions, but Isaac, for you, I'll throw out a few.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Well, wait till you see my response, and you can then judge. But Xi has played his cards very close to his chest. What is clear is that he is a compromise candidate between two factions. He was not anointed, as the previous leaders have all been, by a previous generation. And he's entering power at a time when the strongman model of politics in China is the weakest it's ever been. We've really gone to a collective leadership model. And that was already active during Hu Jintao's time. He really was one of 9. He really couldn't make decisions on his own. He would have to meet in the Politburo. It's a completely different setup than we had, obviously, during Mao or Deng Xiaoping's time, even Jiang Zemin. And we can simply expect that Xi is going to be in that type of a system. There's no way that he's going to be able to really ram things through if he can't get consensus. On the other hand, a lot of people are reasonably optimistic because the consensus here within party circles seems to be that on the economic side, at least, changes need to happen. The question is, these are obviously going to threaten major, important and powerful interests here. So the question is how they square that circle. And I think another interesting issue, particularly for foreign policy, is Xi Jinping's relationship to the military. So he has a much closer relationship to the military than has, for example, Hu Jintao. And the question is, does this mean that he will be able to lead the military, or the military will exert more influence on him? And the sense so far is that it's, the hope, I think, people are optimistic, is that it will be the former. And in that sense, we might see, different types of policies. I think I don't want to get into the whole civilian military issue now. I think it's absolutely clear that the military is under the direction of the party. I just think that it's clear as well that with the massive modernization going on, they've become a more important actor, and that's just inevitable given the amount of resources that they've been given. And obviously all these crises only help them to make the argument, that they need more resources, as any military would make the same argument, whether it's Japan, U.S., Philippines, Vietnam. Everyone profits, right, when things are very rocky. So we'll have to see what type of foreign policy he has. I think what's also clear is that he'll be wanting to focus the majority of his attention on the domestic situation. And that's always been the case in China. And I think now, as I'm not an economist, but it's quite clear that there are several road bumps ahead. There'll be an inevitable slowing down of growth here, which of course has been breakneck, so it's to be expected given demographic factors, etc. So I think that the idea is to spend as much time as possible focusing on the domestic situation, and yet the leadership's gotten themselves into these really these really delicate foreign policy issues this year. And, for example, the way in which China reacted to this Japanese nationalization decision in September binds it into a pretty hardline policy towards Japan because, for example, they announced these baselines, which means that now Chinese law enforcement vessels kind of need to be in these disputed waters alongside Japanese vessels that have been patrolling it for 40 years. And it'll be hard to see how a new president rolls that back because it was done deliberately as a way to cement and empower really that those law enforcement vessels to almost establish an overlapping situation of sovereignty. So this is very worrying for those of us that follow foreign policy, because the question is, how much will he really be able to do, Xi Jinping, given that some of these things have been laid out for him, and being seen as going back on something against Japan, particularly as he'd just come in. It's not an issue on which any new leader in China wants to be seen as weak.
Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for your time. This has been a conversation between Stephanie Kleine-Ahlbrandt in Beijing from the International Crisis Group, and I'm Isaac Stonefish in Washington, D.C. with Foreign Policy Magazine. Thanks for listening.
Great talking to you, Isaac. Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.